hopefully trying to make peace.
Is that enough?
We'll see.
Yeah. Because
it's better than the alternative.
What's the alternative?
Hell.
Islam has now become part of, Western culture.
And we could go back and forth continually about whose historical atrocities were worse.
Yes.
And that's a rough contest because, the devil is definitely in the details there. And then it also brings up the other problem, which is, well, when the Spaniards went to Central America, a lot of the bloodshed they produced, or the death they produced, was actually a consequence of the introduction of disease. Because that took out about 95% of the native population in the Western Hemisphere.
World War I and World War II were nationalistic conquests. They were not religiously inspired. Well, you can argue to what extent were World War I and World War II religiously inspired, but certainly Islam was not a main feature of the 30 million people that died in World War I or however many million people died in World War II. So the point is that we're saying is that, and obviously you've got concepts in the West like manifest destiny.
For example, in ancient Egyptian cosmology, there were four deities, four central deities, although a host of associated deities, and one of them was Osiris, who was the deity of the state.
If you say Muhammad Hijab, you are a hypocrite, you are a bad guy, you are violent. So you know what, that's something I have to look into. It's not always what you say, sometimes it can be what you don't say. So for instance, I think you've become somewhat of an emblem of Western civilization, right? In terms of you're an intellectual.
Heaven help us.
No, but you have. And I also push back on the point that this is a foreign culture, because I think that Islam, and you've mentioned this in the lecture as well, that Islam has now become part of, Western culture.
Yeah, well, that's the open question. As we noted in the introductory remarks, it's like, well, is Islam part of the West? We're kind of having the same discussion about Russia in some real sense. And that's really going well at the moment.
Yeah, so there's that part. But what I would say is that, if there is a bloody history of Western colonialism, and that's almost undeniable. Like, for example, look at Algeria, for instance. Algeria, when it was annexed by France.
There's no dispute in that.
There's no dispute in what happened there. So the issue, I'm giving you one example of many. The Spanish colonialism of Latin America, for example. There are things that happened. And I'm not saying that's not things that happened on only just on the Western front.
Yeah.
There are things that happen on the Muslim front as well, of course.
This is true.
Yeah, no doubt about it, right? No, I'm not going to stand here and, defend the Muwahidun who came and were very intolerant to Jews and Christians and kicked them out of their homes and so on like that, who existed in Spain as well, in fact. So the point is, I feel like, I don't know, as a psychologist, I think my question would be to you, don't you think, is it of any benefit to be concessionary in this regard? Like, to start off a discussion by saying, like, we know that these are things that could cause resentment. Right?
Yes.
Because, like, for example, I know a lot of Algerian people, and this is very clear in their historical memory.
Yes.
And the accusation will be that the West have colonial amnesia here. They are not taking into account what they've done. I'll be honest with you.
Well, they don't even know how. Well, okay. So,
do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, well, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, look, here's how I would address that psychologically. In many of the mythological stories that I've read, there is the motif of the evil uncle. And so, for example, in ancient Egyptian cosmology, there were four deities, four central deities, although a host of associated deities, and one of them was Osiris, who was the deity of the state. That might be a good way of thinking about it. And he had an evil brother, Seth, who was always conspiring in the background to overthrow the state and to establish his own rule, say, based on power. And the Egyptians, this is thousands of years ago, had figured out by that point, because their society was quite large, that there was something in the social structure itself that posed a threat to the structure, and that was the tendency for the structure and its leaders to become willfully blind, and for conspiratorial powers or patterns that would use resentment and the desire for power to overthrow that. And they thought of Osiris as willfully blind and Seth as an eternal danger, and that's true. But there's another element to the evil uncle too, which is that in some real sense, and it's a very difficult thing to sort through morally, all of us walk on blood-soaked ground, because human history is, in some regards, a nightmarish catastrophe. And some of that's just because life was so difficult, but it's also because people did in unbelievably cruel and malicious and deceptive, committed unbelievably cruel and atrocious and deceptive acts. And so we're all stuck with this problem that here we are in relative peace and harmony so far, although we seem to be doing everything we can to try to disrupt that at the moment. And part of the price that's being paid for that is an endless litany of historical catastrophe. And then we all have to face up to, well, what does that mean for us in terms of our individual responsibility? And how do we construe ourselves and our society in light of that fact? And we could go back and forth continually about whose historical atrocities were worse.
Yes.
And that's a rough contest because, you know, the devil is definitely in the details there. And then it also brings up the other problem, which is, well, when the Spaniards went to Central America, a lot of the bloodshed they produced, or the death they produced, was actually a consequence of the introduction of disease, because that took out about 95% of the native population in the Western Hemisphere. And then the conquistadors were, well, maybe they weren't the finest representatives of the highest flowering of Western civilization. We don't know to what degree they were the sort of thugs that couldn't get along at home and went out adventuring. And even if I, say, attempted to take full responsibility for that, I'm not sure what it would mean, because I suspect I have a lot more in common with you people in the modern world than I do with Spanish conquistadors from 300 years ago. Now, I'm not saying I bear no responsibility for the bloodshed of the past, but I would say we all bear that responsibility, and that's something, I would say that's something like the conception of original sin.
Yeah, and that's the point of difference. To be honest, I would disagree with that point. Like, as a Muslim, there is a verse in the Quran that says, وَلَا تَزِرُ وَازِرَةٌ وِزْرَ أُخْرَى, that one soul should not bear the responsibility of someone else's actions.
Yeah, well, that's the other ethical complication. It's like, can you call me out in relationship to the atrocity of the past?
Of course not. No.
Well, but it's complicated, right? Because at the same time you do say, and I don't mean you personally, but you know, we can say things like, well, the West is not bearing sufficient responsibility for its colonial past. And so at some level, that kind of devolves down to the individual.
Hijab takes a hypocritical stance in this opening. He tries to corner Dr. Jordan Peterson about Western colonialism, in essence, saying that because of the evils of America's past, our spiritual influence is nullified. And then Dr. Jordan Peterson, he has a wonderful response to how, if you want to look at it that way, we all are in the same boat, every single nation, because what nation or civilization hasn't been fighting for control and power since the beginning of time? Even in the Bible, God's very own people, the children of Israel, went to conquer a land that was given to them by who? By God, as a judgment, because God said he can no longer tolerate the sin of that land. And so I like how Jordan states that this is very similar to the original sin, that just like how Adam and Eve sinned, we have all sinned and we are all guilty through the inheritance of that sin. And the same way many nations in their history have evils, have sins that all the people of that nation has inherited. But when Dr. Peterson takes this angle, all of a sudden now Hijab, he switches it up. He quotes a verse from the Quran saying that no, he doesn't believe everything that Dr. Peterson just said, because there is a verse in the Quran that actually states that every man is guilty for his own sins. So the opening that he takes in the first place was all pointless. And it seems like all he's doing is just trying to win a debate rather than speak truth. Thank you for watching this video. I appreciate you greatly. I know that your time is valuable, and my hope is that this video added some type of value to your life. And if it did, help us to grow, help us to add value to even more people's lives by choosing to like this video and partnering with us by becoming a subscriber, and also sharing this video with somebody else that you think it can help. I would also love to hear your opinion of this video in the comment section. And if you have a little bit more time on your hands, I recommend you watch this next video that YouTube is recommending for you to watch, I believe that it will also add some value to your life. And until the next time, remember, we all have a mind, but there's no better mind than the mind of God.